Okay, thank you. All right, so there are a number of things that most of the people in this room can just take for granted, but aren't true for a lot of people in the world. So, whoops, I want to not have double mics here. So one is just the ability to open a bank account in a stable currency that won't be eroded by inflation, something like dollars or euros, which you can't do, say, if you live in Argentina for most people, or worse, Venezuela. Another thing that we enjoy is access to well-regulated investments, right? If you're middle class in the US and you manage to save a little money, you can put it into a low-fee index fund, like a Vanguard index fund, and in the long run, you will beat inflation. That is a good way to save for retirement, right? In some countries, you just don't have that option, and so your best bet to try to beat inflation may be to buy questionable real estate investments in ghost cities, hoping that eventually they'll be populated by the time you need to withdraw the money. Another thing that most of us enjoy is the ability to have cheap international money transfers, right? You can go to something like TransferWise and send money abroad in, you generally paying less than 1% fee. By contrast, the World Bank estimates that over the past decade, the average fees paid for remittances have dropped from about 10% to 7%. Right, which is huge, right? So it's going to be many decades before the rest of the world catches up unless we do something about this. And finally, of course, we're used to having these credit cards that let us basically pay in almost any country, often without paying any kind of fee. Whereas for a lot of the world, people are still cash only, or if they're lucky, maybe they have access to mobile money, but that doesn't work internationally, and it also incurs like fees of 1 or 2% for almost anything you want to do with your money. So what I'm going to talk about today is a new financial network called Stellar, whose goal is really to provide more equitable access to assets. And Stellar is the first system that has 3 properties that we think are crucial for achieving this goal. The first is open membership. Absolutely anybody can come to Stellar and can issue new assets or can trade existing assets and hold existing assets. And the other thing is that all developers access the same API. So whether you're a PhD student in this room or a $14 billion mutual fund company like Franklin Templeton or a big company like IBM, you have access, you're a first-class citizen, you have access to the same APIs as everybody else. The second thing Stellar provides is issuer-enforced finality. That means that if you issue assets or tokens onto the network, the security of those tokens depends, you're in control of that security, right? So of course, you need to maintain servers and make sure that those servers don't get compromised, but those servers can be under your control, or you can outsource it to some organization you trust. The third thing Stellar offers is cross-issuer atomicity, which means that you can trade any asset for any other. And that is what guarantees people the ability to bootstrap new markets, right? It also means that you can get the best price on any trade if you're going dollars to euros without trusting the person you're trading with. And you can even trade through multiple assets without taking any currency risk on the intermediary assets. Okay, before I tell you about what we did, let me quickly go over some non-solutions. So first of all, a lot of countries have domestic payment networks that work more or less well. Could we take one of these domestic payment networks and extend it to work internationally? And the answer is basically no, because these networks are extremely tied up in sort of the regulatory frameworks of the jurisdictions in which they operate. And typically they involve coordination by some trusted entity, right? So it's hard to imagine, extending like the US's ACH system in a way that puts the People's Bank of China in the loop. And similarly, like if, China probably wouldn't want to have NACHA in there, and so on, right? And also these systems are closed to new assets. So another thing you might think is, well, who needs a network? Why don't we just have everybody issue their own assets and do their own thing? In fact, we see this with things like PayPal and Venmo and Alipay. The problem here is not only is it closed to new assets, but you can't actually trade across assets, right? So PayPal has owned Venmo for like 6 years, and yet you still can't send, a PayPal user still can't pay a Venmo user, right? So what hope is there that we're going to get complete interoperability with all these other systems as well? And so finally, you might think, well, why don't we just take PayPal and move it onto Ethereum as an ERC20 token, right? ERC20 is an interface that you can do for issuing an asset on Ethereum. And then you'd be able to trade PayPal dollars for any other asset that's available as an ERC20 token. Now the problem here is that you face a double redemption risk, right? So if PayPal issues money onto Ethereum and then that money is redeemed twice, PayPal will be out money that it doesn't have, right? And the best estimate recently is that it maybe costs about $100,000 an hour to attack the Ethereum network. PayPal does $175 billion in daily volume, right? So if you can double spend just a few minutes of PayPal, it'll be like well worth your investment to attack Ethereum. Okay. So now let me tell you about the Stellar transaction model. So Stellar is basically this giant replicated state machine that keeps track of assets and account balances held by various accounts. And the accounts are named by public key, and that public key can authorize operations on the account. And any account can issue assets and own assets and trade assets. So let me give you an example. Suppose we have 3 accounts, Alice, Bob, and Citibank. And Alice walks up to a Citibank branch and physically hands over a dollar bill. In exchange, Citibank signs a message that says, hey, pay $1 Citibank dollar to Alice, and sends that to the replicated state machine, which executes it and now gives the $1 to asset. But what's important is that this dollar is tagged as being a Citibank dollar because it's Citibank that issued it. Maybe Bob comes along and says, hey, I'll offer one of my own babysitting credits in exchange for a Citibank dollar. And Alice says, well, I'll offer a Citibank dollar for that babysitting credit. And those offers cross. Therefore, the replicated state machine executes, fills the order, executes those things. And now Alice has a babysitting credit. Bob has a Citibank dollar. Bob maybe sends that dollar back, the digital dollar back to Citibank, thereby effectively destroying it, and in exchange gets a physical dollar bill from Citibank. So I've told you about sort of fairly simple transactions here that involve one operation, but you can bundle multiple operations on multiple accounts into a single transaction, and they either all execute or all fail, so that you have this atomicity, which is nice. And you can also do these path payments that go through multiple currencies and either succeed or fail. You're never left holding the intermediary currency. Okay, now the problem is that this model only works if everybody agrees on the ledger state. Let's say that, in fact, that's not the case, and so we kind of split this replicated state machine in two, where you have RSM on the right and RSM prime on the left. And now let's say Alice manages to submit 2 different transactions to the 2 replicated state machines. Over here on the right, she says, hey, I'd like to pay $1 Citibank dollar back to Citibank. And on the left, she says she uses a path payment to basically take advantage of Bob's offer and send him 1 babysitting credit in exchange for this $1 Citibank dollar. If both of these execute, it may be the case that Alice gets a dollar bill back from Citibank, but also manages to get Bob's babysitting services. And then when Bob goes to cash in what he thought was a valid Citibank dollar, he finds that this is rejected by the replicated state machine the replica that Citibank's listening to, because it says, hey, actually, that dollar belonged to Alice, and Alice already redeemed it with Citibank. Okay, so what's the solution here? Well, the solution is that Bob had better be following the same server that Citibank uses to redeem its dollars. And in fact, we haven't really talked about why is it that a digital Citibank dollar should be worth $1. And the answer is that, Citibank is a regulated entity. We believe it's solvent. We believe it has a reputation to protect, and therefore we can trust it. And Citibank has to come out and make some kind of statement like, hey, I promise to pay $1 for each digital Citibank dollar that's redeemed with us. But Citibank should also specify how they're going to decide when that's redeemed. So they're going to say, but when the transaction is settled on this particular replica R of the replicated state machine. And so basically, unless and until this R here actually agrees that a transaction has happened, Bob shouldn't believe that it's happened, and therefore Bob shouldn't have been willing to accept this babysitting credit that was redeemed, that wasn't really redeemed because R hadn't seen that transaction happen. Okay, so now what happens if you have 2 organizations that don't necessarily follow each other and maybe don't even know of each other, they're different parts of the world, don't care about each other? Will they agree on ledger state? And the answer is yes, if the kind of follow graph transitively converges at some point. So there's a hypothesis underlying this system that basically any two nodes are transitively going to follow a common node. And through that mechanism, basically by the time anyone agrees on the ledger, the whole world will basically be primed to agree on the same state of the ledger. And this is a hypothesis, but empirically, it seems to be true of the internet, which is transitively connected. And it's also true of legacy payment systems, in which you can basically get a payment between any two banks. It's just very clunky and may involve a fairly circuitous route. And the other thing is, well, let's say this hypothesis doesn't hold. Well, maybe it doesn't matter, right? Maybe you've got a version of the Stellar network running in North Korea that, and nobody in the rest of the world cares about North Korea. North Korea doesn't want to stay in sync with the rest of the world. Maybe that's okay because nobody cared. Okay, so what we need for this replicated state machine is a way to implement Byzantine agreement starting from this internet hypothesis. And we did this using this new consensus protocol called SCP, which is what secures the Stellar ledger. And we've had the safety and liveness of this protocol formally verified by Galois. And actually, the person who did most of that work and also contributed a lot to this paper, Giuliano Luss, is here at SOSP, so you can ask him more about the formal verification if you're interested in that. But the key idea in this protocol is that nodes basically broadcast protocol steps that they're willing to take, but premised on the condition that other nodes are also willing to take those steps, right? So a node V1 might say, hey, I'll choose transaction set T, but only if these other nodes V2, V3, and V4 do. And so you would digitally sign a message like that, and then you can accumulate those messages and see if everybody's been satisfied before taking a step. Now, for availability, you don't want to require a specific server to be up. So instead, we generalize this and introduce this notion of quorum slices, where basically you say, I'm willing to take this step if any one of my sets of nodes called quorum slices is also willing to take that step unanimously, right? And so, for example, the slices for node V might be all sets comprising a majority from each of 3 organizations, right? So you have to agree with all 3 organizations, but the organizations can bring individual servers down for maintenance. And so out of this notion of quorum slice, we can define a quorum as a set of nodes that contains at least one slice of each of its non-faulty members. Okay, so here's kind of an example of quorum slices in action. You may end up with a kind of hierarchical system, but like the internet, there's nobody who would like anoint the top tier of nodes. They would arise out of market forces. So in this case, let's say we've got a top tier that depend on 3 out of 4 of each other, a middle tier that depends on the top tier, maybe a leaf tier depending on the middle. And suppose market forces decide that the top four nodes are the top 4 retail banks in the US, right? And V7 and V8 maybe don't like this. They say, well, we realize we have to stay in sync with them, but we don't trust these big banks. That's okay. They can extend their quorum slices to include additionally one of these nonprofits over here, which have differently aligned incentives. And the nonprofits maybe depend on 2/3 of each other. So assuming that these banks really are evil, suppose Citibank tries to mount a double spend attack, comes to V7, says, hey, V7, here's $1 billion. Please let me immediately walk away with $1 billion worth of goods. V7 says, well, I need a quorum. That's 2/3 of these nodes who require 3/4. Check, that's good. I also need a nonprofit, which needs 2/3 of the nonprofits. Check, that's Stellar and EFF. Good, here's $1 billion of goods. Have a nice day. And then these evil banks get together and collude to pretend that that $1 billion wasn't just sent to V7. And they approach V8 and they say, hey, V8, here's $1 billion. Please give us $1 billion worth of goods immediately and we'll leave your store. And V8 says, okay, let me check if I have a quorum. Okay, well, I've got 2/3 of the, 2 out of these 4 big nodes over here. I also need a nonprofit. Now, Stellar and EFF are not going to agree that this happened because they both know that this is not legitimate. But maybe the ACLU is lagging and V8 talks to the ACLU. But actually, the ACLU's quorum slice requires 2/3 of the nonprofit. So the ACLU says, well, I'm not going to agree to anything unless either the EFF or Stellar does, and they're never going to do that. Therefore, V8 is not going to fall prey to this double spend attack. Now, obviously, I can't do justice to the full SCP protocol in a 16-minute talk, but let me tell you very briefly about one of the fundamental building blocks, which is this idea of federated voting. And this works by you have nodes that vote for statements, where a statement might be, let's choose transaction set T in ledger N for ballot B. And basically, you vote for whatever you think is a likely outcome, likely things that you hear other people voting for. But of course, you could end up with a split vote, right? And so what you do is you move from voting for a statement to accepting a statement once you're in a quorum that unanimously accepts that statement, right? And here, in this example, on the left, you have a quorum, V1 through V4, that just listen to each other. And then you also accept the statement if every single one of your quorum slices contains someone who's accepted that statement. And at that point, you know that either it's true or you've lost liveness because you'll never manage to agree on anything else. And once you have a quorum that all accepts something, then you confirm it, and at that point, you can externalize it. And the cool property is that once a single intact node, meaning one that's kind of well configured and doesn't have too many malicious peers, confirms a statement, eventually all of them will. So I'm almost out of time here, but I'll say that Stellar's been running for 4 years now. It's pretty exciting. I think it shows that open membership Byzantine agreement is viable in practice. And there's a lot of cool projects happening, and the first big Stellar conference is happening next week in Mexico City, so we'll probably hear about a lot more cool projects on the network. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Dave, Ken Berman. I've followed this for ages, and I think it's awesome, and it's really nice to see it in action. I haven't read the paper, so maybe this is obvious from the paper, but how are you dealing with dynamic reconfiguration of the quorums? Because after all...
Thank you. We get it for free. Because it turns out that unlike these traditional protocols where you need to kind of agree on system membership, you can just unilaterally change your quorum slices at any time. And so that actually makes it much easier to deal with certain kind of failures. There is a safety risk that, on some sense, it's as if a bad guy can sort of take old messages and include your old quorum slices and take new messages that include somebody else's newer quorum slices. And so if people, if nodes are malicious instead of just fail stop, it could reduce your safety. But it is possible to reconfigure even in the middle of a ledger.
I'm not totally seeing that. I mean, if I said at the time I issued my transaction that I trust a quorum of these big banks, or I require a quorum of the other 3 left banks, I didn't say that I agree to that 2 years from now when that set is a totally different set because it got reconfigured.
Well, it's not 2 years. It only depends. You're trying to decide one ledger entry at a time. But like, let's say that Wells Fargo's data center had some kind of, which actually happened, they had some kind of problem with their fire alarm. They basically shut down Wells Fargo for a while. They could get out there through trusted channels and say, hey, everybody, we're seriously having problems, and like this is legit, we're not on the network. And then people would just remove Wells Fargo from their quorum slices, and the network would continue. And basically, just enough people would need to unilaterally decide to do that. You wouldn't need to actually run consensus on the fact that Wells Fargo is currently down.
Okay.
Hi, Itai Al-Teknion. I'm wondering whether you can do smart contracts there, where you have state residing on different slices.
Well, I didn't quite hear the question. So we support kind of simple contracts. They're not full-on like Ethereum smart contracts. But maybe I didn't hear your question. Can you say it more loudly? Or?
Yeah, I'm wondering where the state is and what happens if you have times order-sensitive updates.
Oh, well, because you have a consensus protocol, everybody agrees on the exact sets of transactions applied at each ledger, and there's a deterministic order. So every replica of the replicated state machine applies everything deterministically. That's the state machine replication requires this determinism.
Across all slices.
Sorry?
The order is across all slices.
Sorry, the slices are for consensus. The consensus is on an ordered set of transactions, if you will.
Okay, thanks our speaker once more.